In the suffocating heat of late August, the town square of Red Rock offered no shade and zero mercy. The wind that swept through the territory carried the bitter taste of alkali dust and the metallic scent of desperation. It was a frontier settlement that chewed up the weak and spat out their bones. On a raised wooden platform outside the magistrate's office, a man stood in heavy iron shackles. His name was Elias Thorne. He was built like a granite cliff, broad-shouldered and towering, possessing the raw, untamed musculature of a man who had spent his life carving a living out of the high alpine ridges. Yet his head hung low, an anchor of absolute defeat, pulling him toward the sun-baked planks. His buckskin coat was ruined, scorched black at the edges and stiff with dried blood. His massive forearms and hands were wrapped in filthy singed linen, hinting at a recent and terrible fire. The gathering crowd of prospectors, drifters, and hardened ranchers did not look at him with pity. They looked at him like a draft animal. But it was not the thick iron chains binding his wrists that kept the unruly crowd murmuring. It was the bundle he held. Clutched desperately to his broad, scarred chest was a collection of worn gray blankets. From within the folds came a weak, trembling whimper. A newborn infant. Standing at the edge of the crowd, shielding her pale face beneath the brim of a faded bonnet, was Cora Vance. She was 25, 6 months heavy with child, and utterly alone in the world. The brutal frontier fever had claimed her husband Arthur just 2 months prior, leaving her with a half-finished log cabin, a small herd of starving goats, and a mountain of debt. She had come to Red Rock to sell her grandmother's silver locket, hoping to buy enough flour and salt pork to survive the encroaching autumn. Cora wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. Her back ached with a dull, relentless throb. She tried to turn away from the platform, unwilling to witness more cruelty, but the tiny, raspy cry of the infant pierced through the harsh laughter of the men around her. It was a sound that struck directly at her own swelling womb. "All right, gather around and listen up," bellowed Magistrate Thaddeus, a man with a face like tanned leather and a heart to match. He struck his wooden gavel against the podium. "We are auctioning the labor contract of this debtor. $50 covers the back taxes on his ruined mountain claim. $50 buys you 5 years of his sweat and muscle. He is strong enough to swing a pickaxe or lay railroad ties from dawn till dusk." Elias Thorne did not flinch at the magistrate's voice. He remained perfectly still, his stormy hollow eyes fixed solely on the bundle in his arms. He rocked his upper body in a micro-movement, his bandaged thumbs gently stroking the edge of the blanket to soothe the crying baby. "Now regarding the child," Magistrate Thaddeus continued, waving a dismissive ring-clad hand. "The territory has no use for orphans. The infant will be placed on the noon stagecoach bound for the asylum in Cheyenne. We are bidding only on the man." At those words, the silent giant shattered. A sound erupted from Elias's throat, a low, guttural roar of pure, terrifying agony that silenced the entire square. It was the sound of a wounded predator defending its last breath. He lunged forward, the thick iron chains snapping taut with a violent clatter. His gray eyes, previously dead to the world, ignited with a blinding, desperate fury. "Back up, Thorne!" shouted a deputy, stepping forward and driving the heavy wooden stock of his rifle hard into the back of Elias's knees. Elias's legs buckled, but as he fell to the wooden floorboards, he twisted his massive frame with impossible grace. He took the brutal impact on his own shoulder, curling his body into an impenetrable shell over the newborn. He lay there breathing heavily through gritted teeth, his back exposed to the deputies, but his arms creating a safe haven for the infant. His wife was gone. The flames had taken her. This tiny, fragile life, his daughter Lily, was the only piece of his heart still beating. The thought of her being ripped away and sent to die in the cold walls of a distant orphanage was a torture worse than the fire. In the crowd, Cora felt her breath catch. She watched the giant broken man absorb a physical beating just to shield a child. In this brutal territory where men abandon their families for a handful of silver, the sight of such fierce, unconditional protections awoke something fierce inside her. She touched her rounded belly, feeling a sharp kick against her palm. $50, shouted a loud, abrasive voice. It was Hiram Blackwood, a wealthy landowner known for working his men into early graves. "I'll put him in the lumber camps." $55, yelled a cattle rustler. Cora gripped her worn leather coin purse. It held exactly $80, the absolute sum of her existence. It was meant for food medicine and a hired hand to patch her leaking roof before the snow fell. Spending it on a volatile, grieving stranger and a starving infant was sheer madness. It was a death sentence. But then Elias shifted on the boards. He pressed his scarred face against the bundle, his broad shoulders trembling as silent, defeated sobs wrecked his frame. The baby let out another cry, a thin, reedy sound of impending starvation. $70 to Mr. Blackwood, the magistrate called out, raising the gavel. Going once, going twice. $80. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the dusty air with the clarity of a church bell. The sea of dirty hats and worn dusters parted heads, turning to stare at the pregnant widow in the faded gingham dress. Cora stepped forward, her spine held rigidly straight despite the agonizing ache in her lower back. Magistrate Thaddeus frowned, leaning over his wooden stand. "Mrs. Vance, you are a widow in a delicate way. You have no business bidding on a violent laborer." "My business is my own magistrate," Cora said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled beneath her shawl. She walked right to the edge of the platform, the midday sun beating down on her. "I bid $80 for the labor contract of Elias Thorne, and the infant stays with him." "The child is territory property," the magistrate sneered. "She will not survive the week out at your isolated claim." "She will not survive the stagecoach ride by nightfall," Cora shot back. For a brief second she met Elias's eyes. The mountain man looked up from the floorboards. Through the tangle of his unkempt hair and the grime on his face, his stormy eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at her not with anger, but with the bewildered shock of a drowning man being handed a rope. $80 clears his debt entirely, Cora stated, raising her chin, unless a man here wishes to outbid a pregnant widow in broad daylight. The square fell dead silent. Even the most hardened outlaws knew that bidding against a destitute widow was a fast way to earn a bullet in the back from an angry local. Hiram Blackwood spat a thick stream of tobacco into the dirt, glaring at Cora before turning on his heel and walking away. Thaddeus scowled, his face reddening. He slammed the gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the widow Vance. May the Lord have mercy on your foolish soul." The ride away from the stifling confines of Red Rock felt like a slow descent into another world. The Vance homestead sat 10 miles outside of town, tucked against the jagged foothills of the Whispering Pines. Cora drove the team of weary draft horses, her hands tightly gripping the worn leather reins as the wooden buckboard wagon jarred violently over the rutted, sun-baked prairie trails. Every bump sent a sharp ache through her lower back, a harsh reminder of her delicate condition. In the back of the wagon, sitting on a pile of empty burlap flour sacks, was Elias Thorne. He had not spoken a single word since the heavy iron shackles were unlocked from his ankles at the magistrate's office, though the thick cuffs still bound his wrists. He sat with his broad back braced against the rough wooden sideboards, his long, muscular legs drawn up to create a fortress around the baby. Cora glanced over her shoulder as the afternoon sun began to bleed into a dusky, bruised purple. The fading light cast long, haunting shadows over Elias's face. His jaw was covered in a thick, soot-stained beard, and his dark hair hung in tangled, unruly locks. He looked entirely wild, a dangerous beast, caged by grief and iron. Yet, when the infant fussed, letting out a weak, hungry whimper, the giant man would lower his head, his massive burn-scarred thumb, gently stroking the baby's fragile cheek. It was a gesture of such profound, desperate tenderness that it made Cora's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "It will be dark soon," Cora called out, her voice breaking the heavy rhythm of the horse's hooves. It was the first time she had spoken since leaving the town square. "The temperature drops fast out here once the sun dips." Elias did not look up. He simply shifted his massive shoulders, pulling his ruined buckskin coat tighter around the bundle in his arms, shielding the child from the biting evening wind that was beginning to sweep across the plains. Cora sighed, turning her attention back to the trail. A sudden flutter of panic beat against her ribs. What had she done? She had brought an unpredictable, grieving stranger, a mountain man capable of terrifying violence, out to her isolated cabin. There was no sheriff out here. If he decided to break his chains, take her horses, and leave her for dead, no one would know until the spring thaw. But as she pressed a protective hand to her swollen belly, a strange, intuitive calm settled over her. A man who absorbed a beating to protect a newborn child was not a man who preyed on the helpless. The Vance homestead emerged from the encroaching twilight. It was a modest, sturdy cabin built of thick pine logs nestled in a shallow valley, but the split-rail fences were sagging, and the small garden was choked with dying weeds. It was a physical manifestation of Cora's struggle since Arthur's death. She pulled the heavy wagon to a halt near the porch and wrapped the reins around the brake lever. Slowly, with a quiet groan of exertion, she climbed down, bracing her hands against the wooden wheel to steady herself. Elias stood up in the wagon bed. Despite his massive size and the iron binding his wrists, he moved with a stiff, lumbering grace, dropping to the dirt without making a sound. He stood in the yard, holding his daughter, looking at the dark cabin, as if expecting it to vanish into dust. Cora walked toward him, pulling an iron skeleton key from her apron pocket. The magistrate had tossed it to her with a sneer before they left. "Hold out your hands, Mr. Thorne," she instructed softly. Elias slowly extended his forearms. His wrists were rubbed raw and bleeding from the heavy iron cuffs. Cora's small, steady hands brushed against his cold, calloused skin as she inserted the key. With a heavy clack, the lock disengaged. The chains fell to the dirt, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet valley. Elias stared at his freed hands for a long moment. He rubbed his bruised wrists, his chest rising and falling in slow, deep breaths. He looked down at Cora, his storm-gray eyes piercing through the dim light. He opened his cracked lips, his voice rumbling like grinding stones. "Why?" It was a single word, rough and heavy with disbelief. Cora stood tall, refusing to let him see the exhaustion dragging at her bones. "Because my husband is dead, Mr. Thorne. I am with child and I cannot chop the winter wood or mend the roof alone. I needed a laborer." Elias's gaze didn't waver. "You could have bought 10 men for what you paid for me. You bought a broken man and a baby." "I bought you," Cora said, her voice softening, losing its defensive edge, "because I know what it feels like to have the world try to take everything you love. Bring her inside. The wind is picking up." And inside the cabin, the air was stale and biting cold. Cora immediately set to work lighting a kerosene lantern and kneeling heavily before the stone hearth to stoke the dying embers. Once the fire caught casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room, she hurried out to the lean-to, attached to the back of the cabin. When she returned holding a tin pail of fresh, warm goat's milk, Elias was standing in the exact center of the room. He hadn't moved an inch, holding the baby tightly, as if afraid that touching anything in the home would break the fragile illusion of safety. "Sit," Cora commanded, gently pointing to a hand-carved rocking chair near the hearth. She tore a clean strip of cotton from an old dish towel and dipped it into the warm milk. Elias hesitated, his massive frame tense, but the baby cried again, a weak, heartbreaking sound. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered himself into the chair. Cora approached him, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, like one might approach a wounded stallion. She leaned in, bringing the milk-soaked cloth to the infant's lips. The baby blindly rooted instinctively, latching onto the cotton and sucking the rich, warm milk. Elias watched the process, his breath hitching. The harsh lines of his face crumbled. Tears thick and silent welled in his eyes and spilled over his dark lashes, disappearing into his tangled beard. He didn't make a sound, but the sheer weight of his relief radiated through the small cabin. "What is her name?" Cora whispered, keeping her eyes on the feeding infant. "Lily," Elias choked out, his voice thick with unshed grief. "Her mama named her Lily." "She is beautiful, Elias," Cora murmured. "She is a fighter." Later that night, the brutal reality of their exhaustion settled in. Cora offered Elias the small cot in the back room, but the mountain man silently refused. Instead, he took an old wool blanket and laid it directly on the hard floorboards in front of the stone hearth. He positioned his massive body deliberately, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between the front door and the bedroom where Cora slept. Cora lay in her bed, her aching back finally resting against the mattress. Through the crack in the door, she watched the flickering shadows of the firelight. The wind howled outside, scratching at the window panes like a feral beast, but inside the cabin, there was only the crackle of burning pine. Just as she began to drift into a deep, exhausted sleep, she heard it. A low, rhythmic hum rumbling from the main room. It was Elias Thorne singing an old, wordless mountain lullaby into the dark, wrapping his motherless child in the only warmth he had left to give. For the first time since her husband died, Cora closed her eyes and felt completely safe. September bled into October, painting the whispering pines in bruised shades of gold and dying rust. With the changing leaves came the biting, inescapable chill of the impending Wyoming winter. But the Vance homestead was no longer a place of quiet decay. It had been awakened by a machine of terrifying, relentless efficiency. Elias Thorne worked as though the devil himself were riding his shadow. He was up long before the sun breached the eastern ridges, slipping out of the cabin, while the frost was still thick on the glass. The first sound Cora heard every morning was not the roosters, but the rhythmic, thunderous crack of the heavy iron maul splitting oak and pine. He was building a fortress of firewood, stacking cords high against the northern wall of the cabin to insulate the interior from the coming blizzards. He patched the sagging roof with fresh cedar shingles. He split by hand, repaired the broken corral fences, and re-chinked the drafty log walls with a thick mortar of mud and dried prairie grass. He was a man driven by a manic, punishing need to repay his $80 debt in sweat and blistered skin. Yet, the most astonishing sight on the homestead was not the sheer volume of his labor, but how he performed it. Cora had fashioned a sturdy sling from an old soft patchwork quilt. Elias wore it strapped securely across his massive chest. Inside, bundled tightly against the heat of her father's body, rode little Lily. Elias swung a heavy felling axe, hauled water, and dug trenches all while carrying the infant. He moved with a hyper-aware, lumbering grace, ensuring the jarring impact of his work never disturbed the child. To see a giant scarred mountain man, his forearms corded with muscle and tight with burn marks, whispering gentle, rumbling comforts to a tiny baby while he worked the unforgiving earth was a sight that constantly brought a lump to Cora's throat. He rarely spoke to Cora. Their days were defined by a silent, functional choreography. He would leave the split wood by the hearth. She would have a hot plate of corn dodgers and salted pork waiting on the porch rail. He would take Arthur's old Sharps rifle into the timberline, returning hours later with a mule deer or wild turkey slung effortlessly across his broad shoulders. He would skin and dress the meat in the cold barn, bringing her clean butchered cuts so she wouldn't have to look at the blood. In return, Cora poured every ounce of her fading energy into preserving the life he was securing. She smoked the venison over hickory chips, rendered tallow for winter candles, and washed his filthy blood-stained clothes in boiling lye water, scrubbing the heavy canvas until her knuckles bled. She mended his burnt buckskin coat by the firelight, stitching careful heavy seams over the scorched leather. But the frontier was a cruel master, and Cora's body was beginning to fail her. As late October approached, her pregnancy turned into a grueling physical trial. Her ankles swelled to the size of soft apples, throbbing with a dull, constant agony. Her lower back felt as though it were being slowly crushed in an iron vise, and a deep, gnawing exhaustion settled entirely into her marrow. She tried to hide it. She gritted her teeth when she walked, and forced herself to stand over the hot cast-iron stove, terrified that if she showed weakness, the fragile survival dynamic they had built would shatter. She was a widow. She was entirely used to carrying the weight of the world alone. One bitter afternoon, the sky turned a flat, ugly slate gray. The air pressure dropped drastically, signaling an incoming front. Cora was out at the stone well drawing water to boil the daily linens. The wooden bucket was heavy, fully waterlogged, and filled to the brim. She gripped the rough hemp rope, her hands trembling violently as she hauled it over the stone lip. A sudden razor-sharp pain ripped across her lower abdomen. Cora gasped, her vision whiting out for a terrifying second. Her knees buckled and the heavy oak bucket slipped from her grasp, crashing back down into the dark water below with a hollow splash. She slumped heavily against the freezing stones of the well, clutching her swollen belly, her breath coming in short, ragged pants. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over her, blocking out the biting wind. Elias was there. He had crossed the yard in long, silent strides, abandoning his tools by the woodpile. He didn't ask what was wrong. His storm-gray eyes instantly assessed the pale, sickly hue of her skin and the violent trembling in her limbs. He reached down his large, calloused hands, gently but firmly gripping her upper arms, hoisting her up with effortless strength. "It's just the ache," Cora lied through chattering teeth, trying to pull away to save her pride. "I just need to catch my breath, Mr. Thorne. The laundry needs boiling." Elias didn't let go. He looked down at her, his jaw set like granite beneath his dark beard. "The laundry can rot in the dirt, Mrs. Vance." His voice was a low, gravelly command that brooked absolutely no argument. He shifted his grip, supporting her weight entirely against his massive side. The intense heat radiating from his large frame was a sudden, overwhelming comfort in the freezing air. Lily tucked safely into the canvas sling against his chest, let out a soft, sleepy coo. "You bought me to haul the weight," Elias said. his eyes locking onto hers with an intense, burning seriousness. "You don't pull water. You don't chop kindling. You don't lift the iron pots. Not anymore." "If I don't work, we don't survive, Elias." Cora whispered the desperate truth of the frontier, breaking her stoic facade. Tears of pure exhaustion pricked her eyes, spilling over her cold cheeks. "I have to do my part." Elias reached out his thick, scarred thumb, hovering for a fraction of a second before gently wiping a stray tear from her cheek. The touch was astonishingly soft, a fleeting moment of pure mercy from a man whose hands were built for violence. "Your part is keeping that baby safe in your belly." Elias rumbled, his gaze dropping to her swollen stomach before rising back to meet her eyes. "You gave my little girl a chance to breathe. I ain't going to let this land break you in return. Sit by the fire, Cora. I will carry the rest." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his deep mountain drawl sent a strange shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter wind. He guided her back into the cabin, settling her gently into the rocking chair by the roaring hearth, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her trembling shoulders. True to his word, Elias became her hands and her back. He hauled the water, boiled the linens, and even stood awkwardly at the hot stove, clumsily but determinedly, stirring the heavy pot of venison stew. Cora watched him from the rocking chair, the firelight dancing across his rugged features, a profound sense of awe washing over her. He was a man stripped of everything, chained and auctioned on a wooden block like an animal. Yet here in the biting cold of the whispering pines, he was not just surviving. He was shielding her. The silent, broken warrior had transformed into an immovable wall between her and the harshness of the world. And for the first time since her husband was lowered into the ground, Cora realized she was no longer fighting the frontier alone. November did not arrive. It invaded. It came on the back of a howling, merciless wind that swept down from the whispering pines, carrying a blizzard that swallowed the territory in blinding white. For 3 days the sun did not rise. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the moisture trapped within the cabin's green pine logs froze solid, cracking like rifle shots in the dead of night. Inside the cabin was a besieged fortress. Elias kept the stone hearth roaring, feeding thick oak logs into the flames, while the windows rattled violently against their frames. The sheer force of the gale outside sounded like a chorus of screaming phantoms, a relentless assault on the senses. It was on the third night of the storm that the invisible walls holding Elias Thorne together finally shattered. Cora was asleep in her bedroom, huddled beneath 2 heavy quilts, a heated soapstone wrapped in flannel placed at her feet. The exhaustion of her 3rd trimester pulled her into a deep, heavy slumber, but she was abruptly jolted awake by a sound that froze the blood in her veins. It was a scream. Not the shriek of the wind, but the raw, guttural roar of a man being torn apart. Cora scrambled upright, ignoring the sharp protest of her spine. She grabbed a woolen shawl, wrapped it hastily over her cotton nightgown, and rushed into the main room. The fire had burned down to a bed of pulsing orange embers, casting long, erratic shadows across the floorboards. There near the door, Elias was trapped in a violently waking nightmare. He was thrashing on the floor, his massive fists swinging wildly at invisible enemies, his breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. "The roof! Get her out!" Elias bellowed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated agony. He scrambled backward on his hands and heels, his broad back slamming into the heavy oak table. His eyes were wide open, dilated and wild, but he was not seeing the cabin. He was seeing the flames that had consumed his past. "Sarah, I can't reach her. The beam is too heavy." The phantom smell of smoke had triggered his mind, overlaying the present with the horrific memory of the night the bushwhackers burned his mountain claim to the ground. He swung his arm out to ward off falling timber, his knuckles connecting hard with a wooden chair, sending it clattering across the floor. Lily, waking from the commotion in her nearby cradle, began to wail in terror. Cora stood at the threshold of her bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. Approaching a man of his size, a man lost in a violent, panicked delirium, was incredibly dangerous. One accidental strike from his calloused fist could severely injure her or her unborn child. But looking at the giant mountain man, seeing the absolute terror twisting his scarred face, Cora felt no fear. She only felt a profound, shattering empathy. She stepped into the dim light. "Elias!" She called out, her voice clear but remarkably calm, cutting through his panicked shouts. He didn't hear her. He was coughing violently, choking on smoke that wasn't there, clawing desperately at the floorboards as if trying to dig through burning ash. "I have Lily. I have her. Give me your hand, Sarah." Cora didn't hesitate. Moving with an agility she didn't know her aching body still possessed, she crossed the room. She dropped heavily to her knees right in front of him, directly in the path of his thrashing arms. "Elias, look at me," she commanded, reaching out. She grabbed his thick, muscular forearms. The moment her cold hands touched his skin, it was like touching a blazing furnace. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his muscles locked in a state of sheer rigid panic. Elias flinched violently at the contact, a feral growl ripping from his throat as he prepared to fight off whoever was grabbing him. "It's Cora," she said loudly, sliding her hands up to grip the sides of his bearded face, forcing his wild, storm-gray eyes to meet hers. "You are not in the fire. You are in my cabin. You are in the Whispering Pines. The fire is gone, Elias. Look at me." Elias froze. His massive chest heaved violently as he stared at the pale woman kneeling before him. The erratic, terrifying shadows of the nightmare slowly began to recede, replaced by the soft amber glow of the hearth and the gentle grounding pressure of Cora's hands on his cheeks. He blinked, his vision clearing. He realized he was sitting on the floor of the Vance homestead, the howling wind rattling the glass. And he realized that Cora, heavily pregnant and utterly vulnerable, was kneeling inches away from his clenched fists. He snatched his hands back as if he had been burned all over again, scrambling away until his broad back hit the log wall. "I'm sorry!" He rasped the words, tearing from his throat like rusted metal. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his massive hands. "I'm sorry. I could have hit you. I could have hurt the baby." "But you didn't," Cora said softly. She didn't retreat. Instead, she crawled the few feet across the floorboards until she was sitting right beside him. The draft near the wall was freezing, seeping through her nightgown, but she ignored it. She leaned her shoulder against his massive arm. The dam inside Elias finally broke. The silent, unbreakable warrior wept. His broad shoulders shook with the force of his suppressed grief. "I couldn't lift the roof beam," he choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. "They set the fire while we slept. I got Lily out the window, but the roof collapsed on Sarah. I listened to her burn. I couldn't save her." Cora closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her own cheek. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell him that time heals all wounds, because a frontier widow knew the truth. The ghost of a spouse never truly leaves you. You just learn to build a new life around the haunting. She simply reached out, taking one of his large, calloused hands in her own small, trembling ones. "Arthur died of the fever," Cora whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible over the shrieking wind outside. "It took him 2 weeks. It stripped away all his strength, all his dignity. I sat beside his bed, holding a cold cloth to his head, watching the man I loved wither away into a skeleton. I prayed until my throat bled, but no one answered. When he stopped breathing, I felt like God had abandoned this entire territory." Elias slowly lifted his head, his gray eyes shining with tears in the ember light. He looked at the fragile woman beside him, realizing the immense strength it took for her to carry such a burden alone. "But he didn't abandon us, Elias." Cora continued, her grip on his thick fingers tightening. "Because he put you on that auction block, and he gave me just enough money to bring you home." Elias looked down at their joined hands. The brutal, jagged pieces of his ruined heart ached, but for the first time in months, the crushing weight in his chest felt just a fraction lighter. He shifted his stance carefully, wrapping his massive arm around Cora's shoulders, pulling her against his side to share his body heat. In the freezing dark cabin, with a blizzard raging outside, 2 broken survivors sat together on the floorboards, holding back the dark. "I won't let the fire touch you, Cora," Elias vowed. His voice was no longer a broken rasp, but a low sacred promise forged in iron and blood. "I will keep you and that child safe. My life for yours." The blizzard that swallowed the Whispering Pines did not break. By the second week of December, the snowdrifts had piled halfway up the cabin's frosted windows, burying the Vance homestead in a suffocating, blinding white ocean. The temperature remained brutally low, freezing the sap in the trees until the trunks split with sharp echoing cracks that sounded like cannon fire across the valley. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with an agonizing, unspoken tension. It began on a Tuesday morning. The pale, watery light of dawn barely penetrated the frosted glass. Elias was kneeling by the hearth using a whetstone to sharpen his skinning knife. The rhythmic, metallic shh of the blade against the stone was the only sound in the room, save for the crackling of the fire. Cora was sitting in the wooden rocking chair, attempting to mend a pair of heavy wool socks. Suddenly she stopped mid-stitch. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, followed instantly by the clatter of her wooden sewing basket hitting the floorboards. Spools of thread rolled across the room. Elias dropped the knife and whetstone immediately. He spun around his massive frame, coiled tight. Cora was gripping the wooden armrests of the chair, her knuckles stark white, her face entirely drained of color. She stared down at the dark, spreading wet patch on the hem of her gingham dress. A violent tremor racked her body. "Cora," Elias said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides. "It's time," she breathed, her voice tight and trembling with suppressed terror. "The water broke." "No," Elias said, instinctual panic flaring in his storm-gray eyes. He looked at her swollen belly doing the terrifying arithmetic in his head. "It's too early. You're barely 8 months along," the doctor in Red Rock said after the thaw. "Babies do not care about the thaw, Elias," Cora hissed, cutting off with a sharp cry as a sudden violent contraction seized her entirely. Her body bowed forward of her forehead nearly touching her knees. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt. A tearing, burning agony that felt as though her very bones were being pulled apart. Fear, cold and jagged, spiked in Elias's chest. The last time he had been faced with the life-or-death crisis of a woman he cared for, he had been trapped beneath a burning roof breathing ash and listening to the love of his life perish. The phantom smell of smoke invaded his nostrils. His massive hands began to shake, his breathing turning shallow and ragged. The frontier was demanding another life, and he was completely powerless to stop it. "Elias," Cora's voice cracked like a whip in the quiet cabin, pulling him back from the precipice of his paralyzing memories. She forced her head up, her eyes wide with agonizing pain, but shining with a fierce iron-willed clarity. She saw the panic threatening to drown the giant mountain man, and she knew she had to anchor him, or they would both be lost. "I need you here," she gasped, fighting through the crest of the contraction. "I cannot do this alone. Do you hear me? I need you to put the iron kettle on the stove, boil the water, wash your hands. Bring me the clean linens from the cedar chest." The rapid-fire commands worked. They severed the chains of his trauma, giving his desperate mind a physical task. He wasn't trapped in the flames. He was here in the cold, and the woman who had bought his life was begging him to save hers. "I'm here," Elias stated, his voice dropping an octave, steadying into a calm, resolute bedrock. "I ain't going nowhere, Cora." He scooped her up from the rocking chair with terrifying ease, carrying her into the small bedroom and laying her gently onto the mattress. Then the machine of survival went to work. He stoked the stove until the iron glowed cherry red, boiled a massive kettle of snowmelt, and tore clean cotton sheets into thick strips. He scrubbed his massive calloused hands in scalding lye water until the skin was raw and red, scrubbing away the dirt of the frontier. The next 14 hours were a grueling, bloody battle against nature. The wind outside shrieked, threatening to tear the heavy cedar shingles from the roof. But inside the bedroom, the only sounds were Cora's ragged, agonizing screams and Elias's steady, rhythmic voice guiding her through the hellfire. He had seen births in the Arapaho camps during his early trapping days, but he had never delivered a child himself. He relied purely on instinct survival and a desperate burning prayer to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. By midnight, the cabin was a sweltering oven. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood sweat and wood smoke. Cora was fading rapidly. The grueling marathon of premature labor was draining the last reserves of her strength. Her skin was clammy and translucent, her lips taking on a terrifying bluish tint. Her head rolled lazily against the sweat-drenched pillows, her chest heaving with weak, shallow breaths. "I can't," she sobbed, a sound of absolute devastating defeat. Her trembling hands clutched weakly at the twisted bed sheets. "Elias, I'm so tired. The pain, it won't stop. Look at me," Elias commanded, his large hands gripping her shoulders, anchoring her to the bed. "Take care of them," Cora whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "Take care of Lily and my baby. Promise me, Elias." "No," Elias barked. The sudden booming force of his voice startled her eyes open. He leaned over the bed, his massive scarred face inches from hers. He was covered in sweat, His buckskin shirt discarded his corded muscles, trembling from the sheer stress of the ordeal. "You do not get to quit, Cora Vance. You stood in front of a whole town of ruthless cowards and bought my life. You pulled me out of the fire. You don't get to lay down and die on me now. Do you hear me? You breathe." Cora stared into his fierce, stormy eyes. The raw, desperate emotion pouring from the broken mountain man ignited a final dormant spark of defiance deep within her marrow. She gripped his thick forearms, her fingernails digging brutally into his scarred skin. "The next one," Elias urged, his voice dropping to a harsh, pleading whisper. "When the next wave hits, you give me everything you have left. Push, Cora." A massive contraction hit her like a runaway freight train. With a primal, ear-piercing scream that rivaled the winter gale, outside, Cora bore down. She poured every ounce of her grief, her survival, and her fierce maternal love into one final earth-shattering push. Elias guided the infant, his massive rough hands catching the tiny slippery body with astonishing, terrifying gentleness. A moment later, the tension in the cabin snapped. It was replaced by a sound louder than the blizzard, the furious, robust wail of a newborn baby. Elias fell back onto his heels, kneeling beside the bed. His massive shoulders heaved violently as he cradled the tiny, blood-slicked infant in his giant hands. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, tracked through the sweat and grime on his face. He quickly and efficiently cleared the baby's airway with a clean cloth tied off the umbilical cord with a piece of boiled twine and wrapped the squalling child tightly in a warmed woolen blanket. He stood up slowly, walking to the head of the bed, falling to his knees beside Cora. She was completely spent, weeping silently, her exhausted eyes desperately searching the bundle in his arms. "It's a boy, Cora," Elias choked out, his deep voice, thick and entirely broken by the miracle in his hands. He gently placed the bundled infant against her chest, right over her beating heart. "He's early and he's small, but he's got lungs like a bull elk. He's alive. You did it." Cora looked down at the wrinkled red face of her son. She touched his tiny, delicate cheek with a trembling finger, then looked up at the giant mountain man kneeling beside her. Elias Thorne was covered in her blood, looking completely drained, yet his storm-gray eyes held a profound, radiant softness she had never seen before. "Samuel?" Cora whispered, her tears falling freely onto the baby's soft wool blanket. "His name is Samuel, and you saved him, Elias. You saved us." Elias bowed his massive head, resting his forehead gently against the edge of the mattress near her shoulder. He closed his eyes, listening to the synchronized breathing of the mother and the newborn son. In the silence of that freezing, isolated cabin, the bitter, jagged pieces of Elias Thorne's shattered soul finally knitted themselves back together. He was no longer just a survivor of the ashes. He was a guardian of life. Spring arrived in the whispering pines, not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent, muddy thaw. By late April, the suffocating snowpack had finally broken, turning the Wyoming prairie into a quagmire of thick red clay and reviving the dormant greed of the frontier. At the Vance homestead, the brutal winter had forged an unbreakable, albeit unspoken family unit. Elias Thorne had expanded the wooden corral, planted a modest acre of spring wheat, and watched over the two infants, Lily and Samuel, with the fierce, terrifying vigilance of a mountain lion. Cora had regained her strength, her cheeks holding a healthy, rosy flush as she managed the household. The $80 debt had been paid off in bone-breaking labor 10 times over. The paper contract was entirely meaningless now. They were bound by blood, by the snow, and by a quiet, profound affection that had blossomed in the dark of winter. But the past is a shadow that grows longer in the sun. 10 miles away in the smoke-choked back room of a Red Rock saloon, Hiram Blackwood sat across a scarred wooden table from a man whose reputation was as filthy as his boots. His name was Boone the Scar Miller, a notorious bushwhacker and gun for hire from the Dakota Territory. A jagged white line ran from Boone's left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight he had survived by chewing off the other man's nose. "I paid you $500 to clear the squatters out of the high ridges last summer," Blackwood hissed, swirling a glass of cheap rye whiskey. "I need those timber rights to shore up my new mine shafts. You told me the Thorne claim was ashes." Boone spat a stream of black tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "The wife burned. I saw the roof come down myself. Man's a fool to build a cabin out of dry pine. As for the trapper, I figured he burned too. Couldn't find a body in the ash, but nobody survives a blaze that hot. Well, he did, Blackwood snapped, slamming his glass down so hard the amber liquid sloshed over the rim. He walked right into Red Rock last August, holding a squalling brat. Thaddeus tried to sell him off to a labor camp to get rid of him quietly, but the Vance widow bought his contract. He's been out at her homestead all winter. Boone stopped chewing. His dark reptilian eyes narrowed. He survived. Yes. And if he figures out the fire wasn't a stray lightning strike, if he figures out I hired you to burn him out for the land deeds, he'll march into town and slaughter us both. The man is a giant. You left a loose end, Boone. Tie it up. Blackwood tossed a heavy leather coin purse onto the table. Take 2 boys with you. Burn the widow's place to the ground. Leave no witnesses. Blame it on a wandering war party. 2 days later, the spring mud had dried just enough for horses to make the trek out to the Vance claim. It was an idyllic afternoon. Elias was out by the woodpile using a heavy maul to split oak logs. The rhythmic thwack-crack echoed across the valley. Cora was sitting on the front porch churning butter in a wooden barrel, with Lily and Samuel sleeping peacefully in a double-wide cradle Elias had meticulously carved from polished river birch. It was a perfect frontier day, which was exactly why Elias's survival instincts flared. The birds in the eastern cottonwood grove suddenly went dead silent. A moment later, a massive flock of crows erupted from the canopy, cawing furiously as they took flight. Elias stopped midway through a swing. He let the heavy iron maul drop to the dirt with a dull thud. He didn't look toward the trees immediately. Instead, he casually wiped the sweat from his brow, his storm-gray eyes scanning the horizon in his peripheral vision. There, cresting the distant ridge, he saw the faint telltale shimmer of a spyglass reflecting the afternoon sun. "Cora," Elias said. His voice was calm, conversational, but it carried a rigid, freezing undertone that made the hair on the back of Cora's neck stand straight up. "Take the babies inside." Cora stopped churning. "Elias, what is? Now. Do not run, just pick them up and walk inside. Bar the heavy oak door." Cora didn't ask questions. She had learned to trust the mountain man implicitly. She scooped the 2 sleeping infants into her arms with practiced ease, and walked briskly into the cabin, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The dull thunk of the iron crossbar dropping into place signaled the cabin was locked. The moment the door clicked, Elias sprinted. He didn't run for the house. He ran for the barn to draw the impending fire away from the cabin. A rifle shot rang out, tearing through the air, exactly where Elias's chest had been a fraction of a second prior. The heavy bullet splintered the wooden chopping block. "Damn it, he's fast!" a voice yelled from the brush. Elias dove through the barn doors, rolling into the shadows of the hay bales. He reached under the feed trough and pulled out Arthur's old Sharps rifle, along with a heavy leather bandolier of .50 caliber cartridges. He peered through a crack in the siding. 3 men on horseback were breaking from the tree line, riding hard toward the cabin. They had bandanas pulled up over their noses and were carrying lit torches and repeating Winchester rifles. The sight of the blazing torches triggered a blinding, roaring rage inside Elias. The trauma of losing Sarah, the nightmares of the burning roof, the smell of charred flesh, it all coalesced into a cold, murderous focus. They were trying to burn his family again. Elias kicked open the loft door of the barn, stepping out onto the high wooden ledge. He didn't seek cover. He stood there like an avenging titan against the blue Wyoming sky. He raised the heavy buffalo rifle, his massive hands steadying the barrel with terrifying precision. He didn't aim for the riders. He aimed for the chest of the lead horse. Boom! The massive .50 caliber slug hit the lead horse with the force of a cannonball. The animal crumpled instantly, sending its rider, a young outlaw, flying hard into the dirt. His torch flew from his hand, extinguishing in a muddy puddle. The other 2 riders, Boone and a hired gun, yanked their reins, their horses screaming in protest as they spun away from the cabin and charged the barn. "Light up the barn!" Boone roared, firing his Colt revolver wildly at the loft. Bullets thudded into the pine planks around Elias, but the mountain man didn't flinch. He smoothly breached the rifle slid in a new brass cartridge and fired again. This time, the heavy bullet shattered the wooden stock of the hired gun's Winchester, sending splinters of wood and hot metal into the man's hands. The outlaw shrieked, dropping his weapon and spurring his horse to flee blindly back toward Red Rock. Now it was only Boone Miller. Boone spurred his horse directly at the barn doors, preparing to throw his blazing pitch pine torch into the dry hay below to smoke Elias out. Elias reached for another cartridge, but the heavy brass jammed in his pocket. He was out of time. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin was kicked open. Cora Vance stood on the porch, her jaw set like granite. Her gingham dress whipped in the wind. Pressed tightly against her shoulder was Arthur's massive double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun, packed with heavy buckshot. She leveled the weapon at Boone's flank and pulled the front trigger. The roar was deafening. The massive recoil threw Cora backward, knocking her hard onto the porch boards, but her aim was true. The wide spread of heavy lead tore through the air, completely shredding the saddlebags and flank of Boone's horse. The blast terrified the animal. It bucked violently, throwing Boone hard against the wooden corral fence. Boone hit the ground with a sickening crunch. His torch landed in the dirt, sputtering out in the damp spring mud. Elias descended from the loft ladder in seconds, his heavy boots hitting the ground with a thud. He walked toward the groaning outlaw, his eyes completely devoid of mercy. The fire was out, but the reckoning had just begun. The silence that descended upon the Vance homestead was heavier than the winter snow. The acrid smell of burnt pitch and sulfur hung thick in the crisp spring air. Elias Thorne stood over the broken, groaning form of Boone Miller. The outlaw was clutching his ruined shoulder, his face pale and twisted in agony as he writhed in the cold mud. Elias reached down his massive hand, latching onto the collar of Boone's canvas duster. With a single terrifying heave, Elias lifted the man entirely off the ground until they were face to face. Through the dirt and the blood, Elias instantly recognized the jagged white scar running across Boone's jaw. He had seen this man lurking around the high timberline settlements weeks before his cabin was set ablaze. "You!" Elias growled, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure lethal intent. His thick fingers tightened around Boone's throat, slowly cutting off the outlaw's air. "You struck the match. You killed my Sarah." "Blackwood?" Boone choked out, his eyes bulging as he clawed desperately at Elias's iron grip. "Hiram Blackwood? He paid me. Wanted the land deeds. He knows you survived." Elias stared into the eyes of the man who had burned his world to ash. The urge to snap Boone's neck was a physical roaring monster inside his chest. It would require only a fraction of an ounce of pressure. He could end the miserable life of this bushwhacker right here in the dirt, avenging his late wife and washing away the nightmares in a tide of blood. His muscles coiled, ready to deliver the fatal blow. "Elias!" Cora's voice rang out across the yard, sharp and piercing. She had lowered the heavy 10-gauge shotgun and was walking toward him, her gingham dress speckled with mud. Her eyes were not filled with fear of the outlaw, but fear for the man holding him. "Elias, stop!" she pleaded, stopping just a few feet away. "If you kill him, you are no better than the men who burned your claim. The territorial law will hang you for murder, and Samuel and Lily will grow up without a father." The word father struck Elias harder than the recoil of a buffalo rifle. He looked away from Boone's terrified face and met Cora's eyes. He looked past her toward the cabin, where the two infants were sleeping behind the thick oak door. His breathing, ragged and heavy, slowly began to steady. He was no longer just a grieving husband seeking vengeance in the ashes. He was the protector of the Vance homestead. He was the shield for the woman standing before him. With a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust, Elias threw Boone back into the mud. He planted his heavy leather boot squarely on the outlaw's chest, pinning him to the earth. "Get a rope, Cora," Elias commanded, his voice cold and resolute. "We are taking a ride into Red Rock. It is time to have a word with Mr. Blackwood." The journey back into Red Rock felt like a funeral procession, though the corpse was still breathing. Elias rode Arthur Vance's heavy draft horse, leading a roped, battered, and bleeding Boone Miller stumbling through the thick prairie mud behind him. Cora drove the buckboard wagon alongside them, her shotgun resting ominously across her lap, while Lily and Samuel slept safely in the padded birch crate at her feet. The town of Red Rock had not changed since the sweltering August day Elias had been auctioned on the magistrate's block. It was still a hive of desperate men and dust-choked saloons. As the small procession entered the main thoroughfare, the clatter of the wagon wheels drew the immediate attention of the townsfolk. Whispers rippled through the wooden boardwalks. Men stepped out of the barber shop. Women paused outside the mercantile. They recognized the giant scarred mountain man they had bought and sold, and they recognized the notorious gun for hire tied to his saddle horn. Elias did not stop at the sheriff's office. He rode straight to the center of town, halting directly in front of the Silver Spur Saloon, the known headquarters of Hiram Blackwood. Elias dismounted. He didn't say a word to the gathering anxious crowd. He simply grabbed the rope, yanked Boone forward, and kicked the saloon's swinging cedar doors so hard the wood splintered off the brass hinges. The saloon went dead silent. The tinny piano music stopped mid-chord. Through the haze of cheap cigar smoke, Hiram Blackwood sat at a high-stakes poker table, in the back corner, a glass of whiskey halfway to his mouth. Sitting right beside him, counting a stack of territorial tax dollars, was Magistrate Thaddeus. "Mr. Blackwood," Elias's voice was a terrifying rumble that carried into every dark corner of the room. He shoved Boone forward. The outlaw hit the floorboards with a heavy thud, groaning in pain. "I believe you dropped something on my property." Blackwood's face drained of all color, but he quickly attempted to recover plastering on a veneer of aristocratic outrage. He stood up, smoothing his silk vest. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Thorne. Magistrate, this man is a bonded laborer, and he is dragging a beaten man into my establishment. Arrest him." Thaddeus scrambled to his feet, signaling nervously to the two deputies drinking near the brass rail of the bar. "Thorne, you are in violation of your contract. Surrender, or by God they will shoot you where you stand." The deputies drew their revolvers, but before they could cock the hammers, the unmistakable heavy clack-clack of a double-barreled shotgun echoed from the saloon entrance. Cora stood in the doorway, the massive weapon leveled directly at the deputies' chests. Her eyes burned with a fierce maternal fury that dared them to move. "Drop them," she ordered. "Unless you want to explain to the federal judge why you shot a widowed mother in the back to protect a murderer. Put the guns down on the floor, boys," a new sharp voice commanded from the shadows near the back stairs. A man stepped into the lantern light. He wore a crisp dark suit, a silver star pinned to his lapel, and carried a lever-action Winchester. It was U.S. Deputy Marshal Vance Hayes, whose jurisdiction spanned the chaotic frontiers of the Wyoming Territory. He had been quietly investigating a string of fraudulent land grabs tied to the Territorial Mining Office. Marshal Hayes walked forward, his boots echoing on the planks. He looked down at Boone, and then up at Elias. "You brought me a mighty ugly fish, Mr. Thorne. Mind telling me why he's flopping on this floor?" "He tried to burn my homestead today," Cora spoke up, stepping fully into the room, but keeping her weapon raised. "And he confessed under duress that Hiram Blackwood hired him to do it. Just like Blackwood hired him to burn the Thorne cabin in the high ridges last year, murdering Elias's wife to steal the timber deeds." The saloon erupted into chaotic muttering. Blackwood's face twisted in sheer panic. "That is a lie, a desperate fabrication by a hysterical woman and a deranged mountain man. Where is your proof?" "The proof is bleeding on your boots." "Blackwood," Boone spat from the floor, clutching his shoulder. The outlaw was terrified of Elias, but he was more terrified of the hangman's noose. "Tell the marshal about the $500 you gave me to clear the ridges. Tell him how Thaddeus forged the tax documents to put Thorne on the auction block so no one would investigate the fire." Thaddeus gasped, taking a step back. I had no part in murder. Blackwood said the fire was an accident." "Shut up, you fool!" Blackwood roared, his hand diving into his vest pocket for a hidden derringer. He never made it. Elias moved with explosive, blinding speed. He crossed the 10 feet between them in a fraction of a second, grabbing Blackwood by the throat and slamming him violently against the mahogany bar. Bottles shattered, showering them in amber whiskey and broken glass. Elias lifted the wealthy, corrupt mine owner completely off his feet. The memory of the flames, the sound of Sarah screaming, the months of silent, crushing agony, it all surged into Elias's calloused hands. He could end it right now. He could crush Blackwood's windpipe and finally quench the fire in his own soul. Elias. It was a whisper, but to Elias it was louder than a cannon. He looked over his massive shoulder. Cora was watching him. She wasn't holding the shotgun anymore. Marshal Hayes had stepped in front of it. She was holding baby Samuel, and little Lily was cooing in the wagon just outside the doors. "I won't let the fire touch you. My life for yours." If he killed Blackwood now, he would hang. He would leave Cora alone. He would leave his children as orphans in a brutal world. Elias's chest heaved. He stared into Blackwood's terrified, bulging eyes, and slowly, deliberately, he opened his hands. Blackwood dropped to the floor, coughing and gasping for air, a pathetic, broken heap of greed. "He's all yours, Marshal," Elias said. His voice was completely hollowed out, the years of rage finally bleeding away into the floorboards. Marshal Hayes signaled his deputies. "Hiram Blackwood, Boone Miller, and Magistrate Thaddeus. Take them all to the jailhouse. We ride for the federal court in Cheyenne at dawn." The marshal tipped his hat to Elias. "You did a hard thing today, Thorne. A good thing. The territory owes you a debt." Elias didn't answer. He just turned his broad back on the men who had ruined his life, walked over to the woman who had saved it, and gently led his family out of the saloon and back into the sunlight. The summer of 1883 bathed the whispering pines in a golden healing light. The brutal scars of the winter snow and the violent spring thaw had given way to an ocean of tall emerald prairie grass and vibrant wildflowers. With Hiram Blackwood and his cronies rotting in a federal penitentiary in Cheyenne, the dark cloud hovering over the territory had finally vanished. The federal court had not only voided the fraudulent labor contract that had placed Elias Thorne on the auction block, but Marshal Hayes had also personally seen to it that the stolen timber deeds were returned to their rightful owner. Elias Thorne was a free man. He was a wealthy man in land completely unbound by any debt and free to return to the high alpine forests he had once called home. Yet his heavy leather saddlebags remained empty, and his draft horses remained safely inside Cora's corral. It was a warm, breathless evening in late July. The crickets were beginning their nightly chorus in the tall grass. Elias was sitting on the edge of the front porch, carefully whittling a small wooden horse out of a piece of soft pine for little Samuel, who was now a robust, crawling infant. Lily, nearly a year old and walking with a wobbly, determined gait, was happily chasing a barn cat near the woodpile. Cora stepped out onto the porch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her gingham apron. She carried 2 tin mugs of fresh, hot chicory coffee. She handed one to Elias and sat in the rocking chair beside him, the wood groaning softly under her weight. "The wheat is coming in thick," Cora observed, looking out over the fields Elias had plowed with his own 2 hands. "We will have a good harvest, enough to pay for a new iron stove before the autumn frost." Elias stopped whittling. He blew the curled wood shavings off the toy horse, his large hands dwarfing the delicate piece of wood. "You won't need to worry about the cost of a stove, Cora." Cora gripped her coffee mug tighter, her knuckles turning pale. This was the conversation they had been quietly circling for weeks. The debt was gone. The danger was gone. The only thing keeping the giant mountain man here was a choice. And Cora had been terrified to ask him what that choice would be. She had spent her life losing the men she loved to the harshness of the frontier. She fully expected to lose him to the call of the high ridges. "Elias," Cora said softly, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "You have your deeds back. You have your freedom. The mountains, I know they call to you. I saw how you looked at the peaks this morning. I will never hold you here out of obligation. You gave me and Samuel our lives. You owe me absolutely nothing." Elias slowly set the hunting knife and the wooden toy down on the porch boards. He turned his massive frame to look at her. His storm-gray eyes, once vacant and haunted by the ashes of his past, were now incredibly clear, deep and anchored. "You're right. The mountains do call," Elias said slowly, his deep voice a gentle rumble in the quiet evening. "I spent my whole life up there. I thought the high air and the quiet was all a man ever needed to be whole." He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his knees, his massive scarred hands clasping together. "But when I stood on that auction block chained like a rabid dog, I realized a man ain't nothing without something to protect, without a home." Elias reached into his heavy canvas vest and pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment. It was the federal deed to the High Ridge timberland. He held it out to Cora. "I rode into Red Rock yesterday," Elias continued, his voice dropping to that intimate, gravelly tone that always made Cora's heart flutter. "I saw the new magistrate. I had the deed transferred. It's not just in my name anymore. It's in the name of the Thorne Vance estate. Half for Lily, half for Samuel." Cora stared at the paper tears, instantly pricking her eyes, blurring the ink. "Elias, I don't understand." "Cora, you bought my life for $80, Elias said, reaching out to gently wipe a tear from her cheek with his rough, calloused thumb. "But you gave me my soul back for free. You sat with me in the dark when the ghosts came. You loved my little girl like she was your own flesh and blood. You gave me a son to deliver into this brutal world." He slid off the wooden porch, dropping to one knee in the dirt right in front of her. The giant mountain man who had bowed to no one and fought off killers. Barehanded, bowed his head to the widowed frontier woman. "I don't want the mountains if you ain't there, Cora," Elias vowed, looking up into her tear-filled eyes. "I don't want to breathe if it ain't the exact same air as you. I am a broken man, But if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my days making sure nothing in this world ever breaks you again. Marry me, Cora." Cora dropped her coffee mug. It clattered against the porch, spilling dark liquid across the wood, but neither of them cared. She slipped out of the rocking chair, falling to her knees right in front of him. She threw her arms around his thick, muscular neck, burying her face in his broad shoulder. "Yes," she sobbed, holding on to him with a desperate, joyous strength. "Yes, Elias, you aren't broken. You are the strongest thing I have ever known." Elias wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest, as the sun dipped below the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of fire and gold. Little Lily waddled up the porch steps, followed closely by a crawling Samuel. Elias laughed a deep booming sound that echoed across the valley and scooped both children into his arms, holding his new family against his heart. The winter was finally over. The legacy of the Thornvance Ranch became a cornerstone of Wyoming's history, standing for over a century as a testament to resilience and redemption. Elias never returned to live in the high mountains, finding that his true sanctuary was not in the solitude of the pines, but in the warmth of Cora's smile. And the heavy iron shackles from the auction block were never thrown away. Instead, Elias took them to the blacksmith's forge, melting the iron down and hammering it into the heavy latch of their front door, a permanent reminder that the darkest moments of cruelty can sometimes lead us directly to the safest shelter we will ever know.